Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and a while ago I made a video about the Star Trek timelines and trying to explain away all the continuity mistakes using the excuse of time travel, saying that a new timeline keeps getting created every time there is a time travel episode. When they come back to the present, it's possible that the present is not entirely the same as it was. Maybe the main plots were all the same, it all happened the same way, but little details kept changing. Which makes sense if you think about time travel. Why should little events, little changes not affect the future? And I give a lot of examples, such as Tasha Yar's daughter, who didn't exist in the first two seasons of TNG. She only came into existence in the middle of season 3 in the episode Yesterday's Enterprise. And so from that point on, the entire series is taking place in a new timeline, which is different from the first two seasons. And we can use that to explain away a lot of small inconsistencies in the dialogue or the visuals. We can say that all the big events happened the same way, so we didn't really miss anything, but minor small details might have changed. And we can say the same about all the other series. Like in Voyager, they had entire episodes about aliens altering the timeline multiple times, and so even though everything seemingly came back to normal in the end of each such story, we can still claim that little details changed. And I think the biggest change to the timeline happened in the movie First Contact, in which we see the Borg traveling back in time, and before the Enterprise follows them, it actually sees the consequences of the Borg traveling back in time. They see the entire planet of Earth transformed into an assimilated planet. We see that the entire planet is Borgified. So obviously the timeline really did change, and I say this specifically to cancel that claim that this is some sort of a predestinational loop, that the Borg were always supposed to go back in the past and the Enterprise follows them, that it all is a closed loop and so nothing really changed. And so I used this scene, which directly showed that the timeline did in fact change completely, as proof against that claim. And now let's look at what happened when they all came back into the past. We see that the Borg actually killed a lot of people on the planet, so that means all their descendants don't exist, and all the survivors must have led a different life, so already we know that this has to have a massive effect on the future. Also, there are already inconsistencies between this movie and the TNG show, because, for example, Riker says that when you look at the moon from Earth, you should be able to see all the colonies on the moon, and yet when we saw the moon in TNG and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, it looked exactly like today. There weren't any visible colonies. I assume there are colonies, but they're not that big to be visible from a distance. Maybe we can assume some big colony got built right before the movie and after the TNG series. So anyway, they tell Zefran Cochrane the truth. They tell him all about the Borg and the Vulcans and about the Starfleet in the future. So they give him knowledge which he is not supposed to have. And they even show him the Enterprise, first through the telescope, and later when he goes on his warp flight, he actually sees the Enterprise really close by. So this is also an important detail. And in the end of the movie, the Enterprise goes back to the future, assuming that everything goes back to normal. And of course, Deep Space Nine was still on, as well as Voyager, and we didn't see any significant differences in those shows. So we can assume the timeline didn't change in the future because of all these events, because everything seemed to go on normally. But then after Voyager, they made the prequel series Enterprise, and there we see a whole bunch of changes, which to me seems to indicate that a whole new timeline was created, probably from the events of First Contact. So in the very beginning of Enterprise, we see Zefran Cochrane making a speech about the Warp 5 engine, which is the Enterprise NX-01. And when we see this Enterprise, it looks exactly like the Akira class in the future. It looks too futuristic for this time period, so something is already fishy. And let's now look at this image from the first Star Trek movie, the motion picture, and we see all the previous vessels named Enterprise. So we see the ancient sail ship called Enterprise, we see the aircraft carrier Enterprise, we see the space shuttle Enterprise, and then we see some kind of unknown ship which we don't recognize, and then we see the classic Enterprise that we saw in the original Star Trek show. So where exactly is the NX-01? If this was such a famous ship, the first Warp 5 vessel, the vessel that helped create the Federation and all of that, shouldn't it be featured in this display? Instead we see this strange ship which looks more like the kind of ships the Vulcans used in that time period, with that ring-like structure instead of a saucer. And so I say this kind of proves that the NX-01 didn't exist in the original timeline, at least not in the design that we saw it in the prequel Enterprise. So how can we explain it? Well, remember when I said that Zefran Cochrane saw the Enterprise E through his telescope, and later out in space when he was in his warp vessel he looked outside and saw the Enterprise really close by. And he even said, "Sweet Jesus," so that indicates that this was a very powerful moment that he probably wouldn't forget. And then in the first episode of Enterprise, we see that he was involved in the design of the Enterprise NX-01. So what if he kind of gave his input about the design of the ship itself, how it should look like? Because he saw the Enterprise, which he wasn't supposed to see, maybe it gave him ideas for the design of the ship, and maybe they did some simulations and discovered that this specific design is very compatible with the warp field and stuff like that, so that's why they decided to use it. And maybe in the original timeline they didn't know it so soon in the timeline, only much later they figured out the best possible design for a starship. And so presumably in the original timeline the shapes of the ships were totally different at first. And maybe they kind of copied the Vulcans because the Vulcans were their closest friends in space and they saw their ships, and so maybe they decided to kind of imitate that design, figuring it's probably the best possible design for a warp travel if the Vulcans build their ship this way. And so that explains that image we see in the motion picture of that famous starship called Enterprise, which looked much more like a Vulcan ship. So I say that this was in the original timeline in which Zefran Cochrane didn't see the Enterprise E, and that's how the Enterprise NX-01 was supposed to look like. So already this is a very big change in the timeline. Next, there's the whole temporal Cold War, which was constantly mentioned in Enterprise from the very first episode. It was all the result of temporal agents interfering with the Suliban, trying to interfere in the Klingon Empire. All of that caused that Klingon to arrive on Earth when he wasn't supposed to. Also, all these events with the first contact with the Klingons don't really fit with how that first contact was described by Captain Picard. In the episode First Contact in TNG, he once told about the first contact with the Klingons, which he said was disastrous and caused a war with the Klingons that lasted for decades. And so obviously the first contact with the Klingons didn't happen the way that Picard described it later. So it's possible that if not for the temporal Cold War, then Archer wasn't supposed to meet any Klingons, and humanity would only meet them in a very bad first contact, which led to a very long conflict. The next evidence that the timeline changed in Enterprise is the fact that in the episode Regenerations, we see the remains of the Borg sphere from First Contact. And Archer even said that at some point Zefran Cochrane told people about what really happened during First Contact, and that he told some people about the Borg. And so this indicates that the show does take place in a new timeline which was started as a result of the First Contact movie. So we see the remains of the Borg sphere in the Arctic, and some people take out some of the Borg drones which revive, and they steal a ship and they go out into space, and then Archer stops them and destroys them. Archer and his crew, they all saw the Borg, they had pictures of the Borg, so it doesn't really make sense to say that this is a prequel of the older shows, because Picard never knew anything about the Borg when he first met them. He never said, oh, this reminds me of something that the NX-01 once encountered. He didn't say that. It was apparently a brand new species which Starfleet didn't know anything about. And so the episode Regenerations doesn't really fit into the old continuity, so it has to be a new timeline. Even though in the very end of that episode they kind of imply that they say the Borg sent a transmission to the Delta Quadrant for the Borg to come to Earth, and so we can assume that maybe that was the reason they launched their invasion into the Federation during TNG, but in TNG itself there was never any indication that the Borg received the signal, and that's why they came. We can kind of assume that it happened, maybe it didn't happen, but the biggest proof is that Starfleet didn't know anything about the Borg, and so I say that this is proof that Enterprise is taking place in a new timeline, especially because Archer said that Zefran Cochrane talked about the Borg when he wasn't supposed to know about them if not for First Contact. And remember when I explained why the events of First Contact cannot possibly be a predestinational paradox or a time loop. It cannot be because we saw in the beginning of that movie that the timeline did in fact change, because we saw the Earth being assimilated. If it was a closed time loop and everything was just repeating itself in a circle, then we wouldn't see the changed Earth that was assimilated. So it proves that the timeline did in fact change. And the fact that Zefran Cochrane says that he remembers the events of First Contact, he remembers being told about the Borg, that indicates that this is indeed a new timeline. And so maybe he had a hand in the design of the NX-01, which explains why it looks like the more advanced starships and not how it's supposed to look like in the original timeline. And of course we can add to this all the other temporal war things. For example, Enterprise accidentally destroyed a colony, and then Daniels from the future said that it wasn't supposed to happen, that someone is trying to sabotage the mission of the Enterprise. And later the Xindi attack was also not supposed to happen, so the Federation was not supposed to meet the Xindi so quickly, and in the end of season 3 they became allies with the Xindi, and the Xindi had pretty advanced technology which they might have shared with Starfleet. And we had a whole bunch of time traveling episodes with other factions trying to change the past and the Enterprise stopping them, and then everything seemingly comes back to normal. But with all this time traveling, how can we honestly say that nothing changed in the timeline? Another funny fact is that Archer actually kept all that future technology that was left from Daniels, the time traveling guy from the future. Archer actually kept all his stuff and was occasionally using it to achieve things, such as developing a sensor that can detect cloaked ships in order to detect some Suliban ships, and the Suliban were receiving this technology from the future as well. They were not supposed to have cloaking technology, so maybe it all balances itself out, but then later we see the Romulans also with cloaking technology that they're not supposed to have yet, and then Archer uses that technology that he had against the Suliban. He used that against the Romulans as well, partially successfully, and the Romulans having cloaking technology is also a contradiction with TOS, in which Kirk and Spock were totally surprised by the existence of a cloaking technology of any kind. So the Romulans having that in the past seems to indicate that they got their hands on technology they're not supposed to have yet. But Archer himself also now has technology from the future that he's not supposed to have, which he can use against them. And so a lot of factions in the galaxy are much more advanced now than they're supposed to be at this time period. So with all of this in mind, let's now jump to 100 years later. So of course Starfleet would be much more advanced than it's supposed to be at this time period. And even in the Kelvin timeline, in the very beginning of that movie we see the ship the Kelvin, and this is before Nero arrives, and that ship is already looking much more advanced than the ships should look like in this time period in the original series. So I would argue that this is already a new timeline even before Nero arrives from the future. And of course his intervention may have caused even more changes. Maybe Starfleet became more militarized as a result, maybe they sped up all kinds of technological projects, and that explains how come technology suddenly leaped forward so much. So we can explain a lot of things in the events of that movie alone, but I say that the timeline was already a new one even before Nero arrived from the future. And they did mention Archer in that movie. They said that he's an admiral in the future. I guess he's still alive there. I guess medical technology is pretty advanced, so it's possible. And so that movie did seem to indicate that the events of Enterprise also happened in the past, because Archer is a famous figure in Starfleet, that people even heard about his dog. So that indicates the entire Enterprise series did happen as we saw it in the past of the JJ movies. And now let's move to the Discovery timeline, in which Nero didn't come from the future and didn't destroy the Kelvin, and yet all the technology is also much more advanced. So I say all of this is a result of the new timeline that started with Enterprise, that this is a continuation of that timeline. And Archer was also mentioned in that series as well a few times. They said that he was the last guy who set foot on the Klingon planet. And so Discovery also confirms the events of the prequel show Enterprise. And so that's why I think this show is a sequel to Enterprise, which is in a brand new timeline from all the original Star Trek shows. And that also explains why technology is much more advanced, why they have holograms before they're supposed to have them. Because in TOS they never used holograms, they only appeared in TNG, and everybody was so amazed by holograms. And yet here in Discovery they're using holograms everywhere, even inside each quarters. They have their own holo emitters everywhere. Basically every room in a ship can be a holodeck. And maybe this was a result of Archer encountering all kinds of technology that is not supposed to, like those devices from Daniels which he kept. Also he encountered some aliens who had holographic technology, and he even convinced them to give it to the Klingons, which might explain why the Klingons also have these advanced holograms now. And speaking of the Klingons, let's now address one of the biggest issues in Discovery. How come the Klingons now look like orcs and not the way they're supposed to? In the prequel Enterprise they actually had a whole story arc about how the Klingons accidentally created a virus which removed their foreheads and made them look humans. Not all of them, but they said the millions of Klingons will now look like humans, and it even gets passed down to their descendants. Well, I say there was a whole century in between, so maybe the Klingons tried to reverse the effects of that virus, and maybe they overdid it a little bit and mutated into a much more ancient form of Klingons, which we also saw in a whole bunch of episodes. Even in TNG, we saw that ancient Klingons looked much more monstrous, so maybe they kind of activated all their genes too much, and so we can use this excuse to explain why the Klingons look like that now. And maybe later they will fix it and restore themselves to the proper Klingon look. Another point I want to discuss is that in the last episode of Enterprise we see Riker and Troi while they were still on the Enterprise D, so this is supposedly during the events of TNG, namely during the events of the episode Pegasus. If you rewatch Pegasus, you'll see there was no real time for Riker to go play on the holodeck. Also, in the end of the Enterprise episode, Riker says that the holographic simulation convinced him to tell the truth to Captain Picard. And yet in the original Pegasus episode, he didn't make that decision until the very last moment when the ship was in danger. So if he made that decision thanks to the simulation, then he should have told Picard the truth before the ship was in crisis. So if you kind of look at both these episodes back to back, you'll notice a discrepancy. It doesn't really fit together in terms of the plot itself, and even visually it doesn't really fit because, you know, Riker and Troi both look much older and fatter than they were in that episode. Obviously this was filmed about 11 years after TNG ended, but in this video I'm only talking about in-universe explanations for everything, so this is very noticeable that they look different, and also the ship itself looks different because they had to rebuild all the sets, and so it's very noticeable that something is off about the Enterprise. And you even get a shot of a turbolift and it doesn't look the same as all the turbolifts in TNG. And when Riker goes into the holodeck, he's able to simulate different uniforms on himself without actually changing. So it seems as if the holodeck in this episode is more advanced than the one they always used in TNG, because they always had to change their clothes. We could argue maybe this was always an option, they simply didn't use it, but still I would say this is a clue that something is different about the ship in this timeline. So we have different appearance of the internal sets, we have different appearance of the actors. The plot itself doesn't really seem to fit the Pegasus episode. So maybe this entire episode is taking place in a new timeline which is similar but slightly different to the TNG that we actually watched before. And maybe even the events of the episode are actually taking place later. Maybe they only found the ship at a much later time than in the original timeline, and maybe the Enterprise D wasn't destroyed in this timeline, and so maybe they are actually older here. And maybe the events were slightly different, and that's why Riker has the time to go play on the holodeck, and he makes the decision to tell Picard in a different way than he did in the original episode. And the biggest clue is in this scene of them in 10 Forward, which they use stock footage from a season 3 episode, from an episode called Riker Troi, and you even see there are some Ferengi and the Betazoid standing there with Picard. These are events that happen in a completely different episode, and again don't really fit the events of Pegasus, because they are on a secret mission to find a starship and they are supposedly inside an asteroid field, and yet you don't see any asteroids outside the window. And there were no Ferengi roaming around the ship in the original episode Pegasus, so it doesn't really fit. And most of all, you actually see Riker sitting behind those people, and then the camera moves to Riker and Troi sitting at a table. So why was there another Riker in that scene? I would argue maybe that is Thomas Riker. Maybe in this new timeline he decided to stay on the Enterprise and became a commander as well. And that is why you see a second Riker there, so obviously this cannot be the same timeline as the original TNG. So I would say this actually proves my theory that Enterprise is taking place in a brand new timeline. Maybe a lot of the events later in the future happened in a very similar fashion, because the same people are on the Enterprise D, but with small minor differences, which we do see in this episode. So this actually proves the fact that a brand new timeline was created in which the events of TNG are now slightly different than what we remember. So maybe we can argue that all the big events happened roughly the same way, but a lot of little details kept changing as a result of this new timeline. And maybe we can even use the new timeline excuse to explain why so many of the characters look different to their original version. It's possible that some of the people who were born have different genes, because if the events of this whole universe were slightly different, maybe when people had sex, maybe a different sperm cell impregnated them. So maybe a lot of the people who were born in this new timeline are actually genetic siblings of themselves. And some of you may ask, well, how come Riker and Troi look the same? Well, they don't look exactly the same. They looked older and fatter in that episode. Maybe the more you go into the future, the less obvious the differences are. Maybe there is kind of a self-correction mechanism, or maybe temporal agents from the future made sure to correct things so that it will not affect their far future, their history. So it's possible there were a lot of tinkering involved, of temporal agents trying to fix all this mess and to make sure the future is the same as it was supposed to be. So maybe that explains why the actors are all the same in the future, but the more closer you go into the past, the closer you get to where the timeline changed, the more the radical changes you'll see. And so how will all of this affect the future of this franchise? What will we see next in any kind of future show? I will discuss all of this in my next video, discussing in detail the future of the Star Trek franchise and how I think everything should be tied together in the sequel series. So that's it for now. Let me know what you think in the comments and we can discuss it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.